So here we go, my friends. Trump had a victory. Canadian ports being locked out. There is 6 ways from Sunday. So many things we can talk about. But the big thing is, what is Trump's victory going to do to our industry? How is it going to help? How is it going to burden? And what possible hidden things that we have that we're going to see in the next little bit today on The Logistics Life. Hey there, my friend.
Hey.
Dean, what a day. And you know what? It's interesting that today is Data Day because last night, the election, Trump's victory, Kamala Harris not even showing up on stage afterwards. All these things that, you see that little dig? That was quick. You see that? I get that pretty good. All these little things that are happening, you know, the BC ports actually locking the unions out as opposed to the unions going on strike. Montreal port on strike. You know, we've got the looming January 15th strike in all of, you know, the East Coast and West Coast. Lots of things happening, my man. You know, the last push before the holiday season, Cyber Monday, Black Friday, you know, my gosh, brother, so much happening in such a short period of time, it feels like.
I think Kamala Harris took Trump's lead, right, by not acknowledging the victory last time.
Yes.
He didn't show on stage. He kind of ran for cover and declared it a stolen victory. But I guess the voting machines all work this time around, right? Huh? I'm waiting for it. Like, where are the? All I hear is crickets. Oh,
you know, Dean, it's so interesting. Over the last little while, I've been really looking at this word accountability.
Yeah.
Right. And really diving deep into it, because as we're building, as we're doing things, you know, you sit here and you think it is so easy.
Yeah.
To say, oh, that's where the issue was.
Right.
So that's who I'm going to blame.
Yeah.
But, you know, as a leader, as you are in your company, you know, I don't know. I'm starting to say, no, it's my fault. It's my fault. 100% my fault. Even if I wasn't actually part of the breakdown, it's my fault. And
a lot of people are hurting, Dan. A lot of people are hurting, and this is a backlash from the pandemic, mandates, high inflation. You know, if you look at the last 4 years of the current administration, what a time to be trying to get another term, like in administration. Like, you think about how historic that's been. I think a lot of people have been wanting to find someone accountable for it. To your point, I think it's exactly what's gone on. I see truckers on social media already talking about accountability, right? And blaming all of their woes on the current administration. And in the same breath, Trump will fix it. Well, if that was the case, we wouldn't be in the predicament we're in. If it was that easy to pull levers that could suddenly change the rate per mile. You know, this is like trying to steer a massive oil tanker, right? It takes time to move this around. Inflation's coming down. We're starting to see seasonality emerge in the freight market. Diesel prices are coming down. There's lots of things happening that have nothing to do with the person in the Oval Office, right? There's lots of macroeconomic factors. But unfortunately, I think people look for someone to blame. You know, so they want to make someone accountable for it. And I think in this instance, a lot of them have wanted to make the current administration accountable for their economic woes. I think there's a lot of people that are hurting financially, Dan. I think that's what's underestimated here. You know, we live in a pretty easy part of the world here in New England. You know, we do well, but we do well because I decided to, right? I took all the risks. You know, I've been broke a few times and worked very hard to get where I'm at. But a lot of people would not take that approach and say, if it's to be, it's up to me. They would rather blame everybody else for low rates, in particular, to use an example, when low rates to one guy could be a high rate to another, right? So it's like, you know, you're selling capacity on a backhaul lane. Those rates are lower than the headhaul lane. Like, that's just economics, supply and demand.
Yeah,
that's not anything to do with, you know, someone sitting in the Oval Office, because if he's talking about political side of it, that's kind of longer term strategic stuff, right? You know, that's the sort of stuff that moves. You know, think about tariffs, Like if we put tariffs on, or we don't support the labor movement, we have strikes in BC, we have rail strikes, we have port strikes, we have a lot of labor unrest. Think about the impact of a trade war on the export of Canadian grain to Asia. Think about the flow of freight into the east and west coast. If we bump up tariffs to 60% on goods from China, does that do what's already happened? And that's forced Chinese distributors to send more direct to Mexico. And then we have more freight coming across the border.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I mean, you look at it just with the BC strikes. Like, I call them strikes, but the BC lockouts. I sent you that article this morning. $9.7 million a day in lost revenue just in the potash industry.
Yeah.
$10 million a day, Dean. So we're sitting here in day 3.
Yeah.
$30 million lost. By the end of the week, 50. By the end of the weekend, $70 million lost. We're also talking a week delay for every day the ports are locked out. So, and in that article that I sent you, it said like it's only a matter of time before all of this hits us.
Yeah.
So all of this turmoil, I often share a story, and I'm sure I've shared it with you before. This is perspective. Like everything comes down to perspective, right? And what is expensive to one, like you said, is not expensive to another. Meaning when somebody thinks, $1.60, oh my gosh, that's a great rate because I used to get $1.20. But if you're getting $2.10, $1.60 is a bad rate.
Right. But
you would never know a good rate if you never had a bad rate.
Right.
I often use the example when I'm talking to prospects where I have a buddy, loves music. It's he lives for music.
Right.
He bought a $10,000 stereo. To me, that makes my sphincter tighten up like a duck underwater because I'm like 10 grand on a stereo, not a chance. But I'm a golfer. Right. You show me a putter that's going to knock 5 strokes off my game, I'll pay 10 grand for that.
Right.
Just for the sake of being able to whoop my buddies' butts and having that bragging power. And I mean, it's not like I'm ever going to win 10 grand back. I don't, but I mean, I might win $20 a round, 7-10 rounds a summer. I might win $200, but it's worth it. Right. So it's all about that perspective piece. I can tell you there's a lot of companies out there, Dean, that were waiting for yesterday to happen before they put things into action.
Yeah. To me, what sort of things? What do you think? What sort of things, Dan? What were you hearing? Like what sort of things?
There was so my brother-in-law is in the automated welding industry. And many automotive, including the big Canadian one that's probably the biggest producer of automotive parts, put holds on tens of millions of dollars in robots and welding machines because they were like, we don't know what's going to happen. And it's mainly based on the policies, right? And I don't want this to get into a political one, but for example, Trump was saying, okay, if I win, I'm going to put a tariff on Chinese and Asian automobiles because they could, they were looking at from my investigation and if anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, I apologize, but from my investigation, and we're only good as the data we collect, but I thought I did pretty good. Asian companies were looking at building one of probably the largest automobile manufacturing facility in Mexico. Yeah. And what it was supposed to do was, from my understanding, was pump out more vehicles than the top 3 combined in a year. Yeah. And Trump said, if I win, I'm going to put like a 300% tariff on all of those vehicles. They're not going to flood the market. Yep. So the big 3 were kind of saying, okay, if he doesn't win, the other side is not putting a tariff on that. So do we go and invest $100 million in new robots to get smoked in 6 months or a year by this Chinese manufacturers? So that kind of thing, I think, has really impacted our markets. I've been selling a lot lately, and I've had a lot of conversations where they're like, yeah, we're looking at it, but we're kind of waiting for the election to die down. And I don't know if it was more, speaking to other friends of mine in the US, some of them were like, I'm preparing for civil war. We look at what's happening in Canada. I don't know if you guys are seeing that, but in Brampton, there is Israelites running around the streets with swords, vandalizing and beating people with flags. There's Indian communities, Punjab communities, all these people screaming for Indian military to come in and raid Islamic temples. Like the chaos that I'm seeing is just crazy. And
nuts.
You know, a lot of people say it's the leaders, and of course it is. You know, like you could say so many things about the US, so many things about Canada, about immigration. You know, Doug Ford now came out in Ontario and said we're ceasing immigration in Ontario because, you know, people are saying the political leaders are immigrating people into the states or provinces that are swing states, swing provinces, in order to keep themselves. Like, there's all these conspiracy theories, and it's like,
again, it's accountability, Dan. It's blaming someone else, right? So it's like, who's doing the hardest job in trucking, which is long distance team driving? Who do we think's doing that?
Yeah, the drivers.
Well, a lot of them are Punjab Sikh drivers.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you just look at Diwali, what we talked about last week, right? Diwali in California. We see it. We are seeing it across the board with rates, with capacity, with everything. Because even if, you know, I mean, when you and I spoke last week, I reached out to my team and I said, FYI, just found out this information. 40% of California drivers are Punjab. And it was all of a sudden bells went off. And I remember one of my ops guys, Joe, going, now I get it. Now I get it. He goes, last week we were golden. This week he goes, like, I didn't know what was going on. And this is reality.
Well, Dan, immigrants tend to do the jobs. They fill the void that other people, jobs they don't want to do. You know, so I was out in Nebraska at the Greater Omaha meat packing facility, right, where the world's largest stockyards used to be, right? And there'd be maybe 20 to 30 cattle pots coming in every hour with, you know, Nebraska, Iowa beef, prime beef to be slaughtered. And so who's working there? Who do you think's working on the shop floors? When I sit outside the meat works and I watch that shift change, who do you think are inside working in the meat plant, the meat packing plant? Immigrants, Dan. So this is so, and it's the same if you go to California and you look at who's harvesting cabbage and lettuce in Salinas, who's doing the backbreaking work in 100-degree sun, right? Now, a lot of those immigrants come in with their visa program. They come in and go back, right? So we actually need a lot of immigration. But the problem is, to a lot of people that are racist and want things to go back to the way they were, you know, anti-browning of America, browning of Canada is kind of the general theme. Anybody that's not white. Dan, I've been told to go back where I came from because I speak differently. And to a person that looks through the racist lens, everybody that's not like them is suddenly the enemy. And that's what I've been here 25 years. And it's a very different, North America is very different over that period of time. But so is Europe, so is Australia. So there's a whole generational change that's occurred as us baby boomers get older and kind of work our way out. Because a good example is the old school versus new school truckers. But the old school guys like me are perplexed at how unprofessional and not serious a new generation is. Well, the new generation's not like us. They view work very differently. They don't have the same view of work as, you know, because we grew up in an era where we were grateful to have a job. Right. Yeah. Another generation now, you look at it and think some of them feel very entitled about this, and it's accountability. It's something I'm doing between other jobs. So there's a lack of long-term view to it, and I think that's across a lot of different industries. So my view is that's change. Change is constant, and you've got to figure out a way to adapt to it because things aren't going back to the way they were. You know, and
sorry, go on. You don't what?
I don't want trucks to go back to diesel belching black smoke behemoths, right? Yeah. But I also don't want net zero regulations mandated on trucking when we don't have the infrastructure to power trucks with battery charging facilities. Yeah. Right. So there's got to be a middle road, and I feel we've had a whiplash to the far left woke movement, and
I agree.
And so the pendulum has moved back the other way a little bit. Too far, in my opinion, to the right extremist side. It'll come back like this. It'll rectify itself. But we're in the retaliatory, reactionary phase. back to the other. I see it in Canada, I see it here, and I see it in Australia, and I think it's got a lot to do with. I think people are hurting economically. You know, the inflation's put a real bite on people. It's harder for kids like my young kids, 24, 25, to get ahead in life, to make money to buy a house. So I think
my
a lot
son's
of people
doing 3 jobs just to try and stay ahead.
Think about school teachers buying supplies for their kids, or people working multiple jobs just to get by. I think a lot of people are really struggling, and I feel for them. But I think what we're seeing politically is a reaction to all of that, and we want someone to blame, we want someone to be accountable for this, and we somehow think that'll be the magic fix. And I'm not sure it's a magic fix. This stuff takes time to change.
Well, you see, I agree. I don't think there's any magic fix. And I think it all comes down to us. We're responsible for everything we do, and every action we take, there's an equal or opposite reaction.
Right.
But, you know, you said something there that really made sense. And it's a great transition into our first topic, where you said, you know, things change.
Yeah.
Things are changing, and there's no going back. And, you know, you look at that piece of it when it comes to the ports, and let's use the ports as example, right? East Coast ports, West Coast ports start on strike. East Coast ports on strike. Now Canada's locked out their ports.
Yeah.
One of the biggest conversations is pay and automation. And as we said before we got on, you know, here's how I see it. And by all means, any longshoremen and everybody out there, I'm not trying to disrespect what you do for a living. Very, very difficult work. Very big challenges, very dangerous. But here's the thing. I think all of this is actually going to do what COVID did for the electric vehicle. COVID had a huge push on electric vehicles. COVID had a huge push on working remotely. It was starting to take place, but COVID just expedited
it. Yeah.
Right now, you look at companies, the amount of buildings that are up for lease, the companies realizing, I don't need a $15,000, $20,000 a month rent when most of my team can work from home. Like, companies are scaling back their facilities.
Yeah.
And I think all of these strikes are now putting a huge push for automation, because what doesn't go on strike? A computer system.
Right.
What, you know, and I'm sitting here, Dean, and part of what we talked about before we got on is every other country is going towards this automation. They're retooling their people. North America, I fear, is going to become third and fourth rate in the world. And it's and I get it. Trust me, Dean. I mean, we have conversations all the time. What is AI going to replace? You know, bank tellers. When is AI going to replace bank tellers? And you can literally talk to a machine and it'll give you all the advice based on there's all these things, and people are very concerned about it. I think the human element will never go away. Because people want to deal with people. They don't necessarily want to deal with machines. Like, how many times, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's times when I'm talking to a chat and I prefer to talk to the chat because it actually gets to the answers quicker than a human at some points. But at some point it's like, okay, I'm either not explaining it properly or maybe so just give me a human agent. Right. And then the chatbot throws you to a human. So there's always going to be that. But when I look at this, right, like for example, let's take the trucking industry. Okay. I believe part of the reason truck manufacturers came out with automatic vehicles is because they saw drivers are not going to be the way they are now in the future. How do we make it easier for them? Right. Like, how many of the new drivers these days would prefer a standard, you know, a stick truck? Probably very few. Right. Because there's more things they need to do. Right. You look at automobiles in general. Most automobiles now, even to the point where most Ford Mustangs, a standard almost isn't an option for most. Like, right. Like think about it, but it changes, you know, how many people these days, and here's a big one, and it's one that I consistently think about. How many people these days do not use their mirrors because they have a reverse camera? I know, a lot. And they're different though. My neighbor loves hers, but she said her mum's BMW is awful because it's different. There was no sort of standard in how they work. But yeah, there's a lot of people that just do that. I can't. I'm hardwired to look over my shoulder because that's how we were taught when we got our license test. Yeah. So like in my truck, I find myself after a week it's like, my God, I didn't use my rearview mirrors this week. So then I go back and I make a conscious choice to back up using my rearview mirrors.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. That whole distance thing is friggin' awesome when it comes, like, but it's cool, that tech. When I got my Ford Fusion Energy, it had that park assist where it was like, I don't have to parallel park anymore. I used it once.
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel in control.
Right.
That's my perspective.
Right.
Somebody else I know, they're like, I've never parallel parked in my life because I've always had a car with a button. I will not buy a car unless it has a parallel park button, because they just can't do it. But they can do it. They've just not taken the time to teach themselves and educate themselves and ingrain it so it becomes a habit.
This is a great example.
This, I think, is what the big issue is.
Well, it's a generational change, Dan. It's the the loss of automotive industry jobs on factory floors and automation, right? It's for the last 25 years, we've been using China as our manufacturing warehouse. Like, so China, this has been a long game that they've played, and they've finally become integral to everyone's supply chains. The irony is, and it's kind of borderline hypocrisy, but a lot of people will complain about Chinese imports and be railing on China while they're on their iPhone that's made in China, right? Right. So if you think it through, like, we've become highly dependent on trade, and you can't just have this blanket view that if we suddenly throw tariffs on imports that we're not going to see repercussions here, because tariffs are essentially something that we pay for through the cost of our goods, makes our goods more competitive, less competitive, more costly, but it affects our exports also because we have a lot of trading partners that we deal with. So there's impacts all around on that. And I just find that people become very one issue, like they're very single issue type people, whether it's, in trucking, there's a lot of trucking operators that are very anti zero emission mandates. There's a lot of people here in New England that are really angry that their truck dealer can't sell them a diesel engine truck until they buy a battery powered truck. But they're really frustrated with that. So, and I think, large truckload CEOs are saying, hey, these costs are burdensome on our industry by mandating us to use a certain percentage. And they're saying, we're not anti, green energy. It's just that the regulations are burdensome and not practical because you don't have the infrastructure to support it. So I think there's a lot of issues that are very important to an industry's survival. And I think that's behind a lot of the votes. You see a lot of people voting for single issues, and the economy's been a big part of it, Dan. Like, we're coming out of something that's just been unprecedented. So I feel that, truckers in particular saying that suddenly Trump's going to fix it. How do we reduce the amount of trucks on the road? How does that magically happen so that rates start to go up? Or how do we create more demand for things that we use that means more freight for us to haul and more loads for us to manage through our non-asset divisions? That stuff takes a long time.
And you said something there, Dean, that kind of sparked something, and I'd love your thoughts on it before we move to what we see for 2025. When we as humans have the belief that if something happens externally, it's going to fix things internally, it creates this, almost this, and I hope this is what happens in the next coming while, because Trump did win. For all of those people that believe that, I hope it turns their mindset around to say, okay, here we go. Because if you look at like Napoleon Hill, when they, when the right, the left, during the Great Depression, when everyone came together, and if you do research on it, you'll see that what they started to do, instead of posting in the newspapers and the radio stations and talking about lack and depression, they started talking about prosperity, abundance, and all these other things. And when you talk to historical people, they say, like, one of these big things is why we got out of the depression in the first place, because we started talking about better things. When we talk about positivity, uprising, when we talk about the benefits, the things that are happening, the good things, more good things start to happen. It's just the law of attraction. It's the way we work. It's the way the universe operates. And for people that don't believe it, that's fine. It's what I believe. And I can tell you, when I started, when I was going through everything I was going through, and I started to change my mindset, everything around me changed. And I hope that's what happens. I
Right.
really do, because we are the ones that are going to change our industry. Like, for example, we look at where we are right now, right, Dean? Over the last couple of weeks, we've really talked about this runway that is literally at the end or being very short, right?
Yeah.
So we're running into this last hurrah, the way I see it. And here's my view, regardless of who won yesterday,
Right.
it's irrelevant. Here's what I saw. And sorry, my perspective is it's irrelevant. Here's what I saw. We are at the end of the runway. There's going to be this last little push before Christmas, right? Cyber Monday, Black Friday, US Thanksgiving, holiday shopping, all this. January and February are going to be very critical in our industry. I think that's going to pull the last piece of overcapacity out of the market, because I think people are going to say, well, I was in it. I did it until the new year. I'm going to start the new year clean. I'm out. Or I'm going to retool, whatever the case may be. I think that is what's going to happen. Now, who will they relate that back to? A political party? Probably, because it just so happens that's when the transition's happening. But would it have happened anyways? I do believe so.
Yeah.
I do believe this point we're at a crossroads. We really are. And we're at a Y in the road. And when that Y is realized, I think we're going to be in a much better place. What are your thoughts?
I think so. Yeah, I think we're going to pay for this now. We're going to pay for. So if you think about what's the demand driver for higher imports, record imports in September, we'll have October's out Monday, so we can talk about it on next week's show. But we will pay for it in lower volumes early next year, right? So we're pulling it forward, right? Now that the Trump administration's in and they're talking about a 60% tariff on Chinese imports and 10% on all other imports, that the experts say that's going to raise consumer prices somewhere in the 1 to 5% range, which is equivalent to 7 months of expected inflation. So that's going to force things up. So what people will do is the same thing they did in 2018-19 to avoid the first round of Trump tariffs. Was it 18-19? I think, yeah.
16.
No, they came in 16, but the tariffs was it late 17-18? Sorry.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, I apologize. Yes. And that was when everybody started pulling stuff forward from aluminum to steel to everything. Yeah.
So part of the pull forward of imports already, part of the thinking has been to get ahead of these tariffs, because a lot of people figured that the Trump administration would win and tariffs were a more likely outcome. But I think now that that's the case, I think you'll see a surge in imports between now and the end of January. Before the administration can enact these tariffs. So that then says, okay, you're going to have a lot more volume coming into our ports, and that means March, April could be quieter than normal, right? So it's like it's not the lack of seasonality. Seasonality disappears on the import front then, because you've got a January 15 strike that could upend things. You've got a lot more shift in volume to the West Coast. You've got a port strike in British Columbia that's going to send a lot more ships into Seattle, Tacoma, right? And that's going to change. I mean, Dan, they run 4 trains a day off Prince Rupert to Chicago, like intermodal. Like, so, Prince Rupert's a very strategic point for freight that goes to the Midwest. If you start to disrupt that, you start to disrupt trade flows, and that starts to impact the trucking market. So, part of me says the trucking market kind of thrives on volatility. Same in your line of work, right? Because volatility means opportunity to get involved, to find solutions. Sometimes it means higher rates, but it also means a freight imbalance. And so the net isn't an overall rise in rates, because you can have rates go up on one lane and down on another, depending on the imbalance of freight. So there's lots of things that are going to happen next year. But Dan, I think the biggest impact, so tariffs are one thing that's going to impact our industry. The other are going to be emission standards, a serious rollback of emission standards. So I think the bigger impact is going to be on the regulatory side, because the head of the EPA is going to be an appointment. And I think they're going to seriously roll back. I read a study that talks about the executive order setting existing greenhouse gas targets, resetting the timelines and targets there, where a certain percentage of vehicles have to be battery powered within a certain time frame. I think the numbers are something like, I can find it here. It's kind of part of the CARB program, where automakers have got to have a certain number of their vehicles sold that are zero emission vehicles, ZEVs they call them. So I think you'll see a rollback of some of that. The big one that kind of impacts even right down to me is the expectation that they won't go ahead with speed limiters for all trucks. Because that's a big one in terms of how it impacts capacity. Because when you start to roll back speed on trucks, you decrease.
You get
capacity.
less done in more time. Yeah.
Right. But we've still got more trucks in the market. Now, we're still in this phase where we had 2 big bankruptcies go this week, 2 Chapter 11s, a 300 truck fleet, a 400 truck fleet. This week alone will exit the market. I don't think their businesses are sustainable. So, and if you think about the food industry, we've had, thank God it's Friday, TGIF declared bankruptcy this week. They're talking about large food chain restaurants, having more bankruptcies this year than they've had in decades. Of course, it was an aging business model because a lot of us are now buying things through, DoorDash and Uber Eats. So there's the convenience factor of eating at home as opposed to going out to a chain. So that whole business model was questionable. But it's just another.
And do you think, Dean, some of that also comes with people are thinking healthier?
Yeah.
Do you think that has any impact on it?
I think it's more cost, Dan. I think it's more cost inflation. There was a lot of gouging went on during the pandemic. You and I saw it. Like you were part of it, like with trying to move freight on trucks. Like your bed linen example to Los Angeles to Orlando, I think it was. There was a lot of price gouging going on. Some of it was deliberate. I mean, some of the food manufacturers admitted in Senate hearings that they charged way above what inflation was. I think people are really reacting to that, and that's what's going to be the big change this year. Is just bringing it back to trucking. I think it's going to be a big impact on regulatory front. I feel for the people on the immigration side of things. I think that's going to be a pretty rough ride for a lot of folks that have been trying to escape, war-torn countries.
I think we're also going to have a big push in the next probably 6 to 12 weeks on warehousing as well.
So
all these people that are pulling goods forward because they want to avoid the tariffs or the possibility of tariffs on their goods. I think now that it's a done deal, Chinese New Year tariffs, they're all kind of coming down at the same time.
Right.
I see a big push on people pulling product in and getting new warehouses. Like I got a customer that used to have 1.3 million square feet of warehouse space. They're now down, but the warehouses that they own are at like 130% capacity. They start pulling more stuff forward. They got no room to put it. The reality is the costs are going to go up. And if those costs start going up, then we start having another kind of rollover where companies are spending so much more to get their product in and warehouse it and all this to avoid tariffs. I guess they're going to have to look at that juxtaposition. What's more beneficial? Do we just pay the tariffs and deal with it? Or do we pay the extra cost of warehousing? And then that piece is, if you pay the extra cost of warehousing, prices go up, are people still going to buy it?
Yeah,
it's this huge vortex of it's crazy.
Dan, the reason that podcasts like this evolved out of the pandemic, right, was our need to communicate. But we've also thrived on volatility and supply chain disruption because we've got a never-ending list of stuff to talk about. So my closing advice would be, if you think the last 4 years was a roller coaster ride, strap in. Because I think we're in for a pretty big roller coaster ride next year.